Welcome back to Higher Exchanges. I'm your host, Jesse Redmond, Head of Investor Relations and Business Development at Leaf Brands. I'm joined once again by my friend, Morgan Paxia. Morgan, what's going on, man?
I'm enjoying the start of local summer here in San Diego. So all good, it's beautiful, and I hope to get outside and see some sunshine today.
Yeah, Aaron was commenting on your golden tan before the show started, so I think you might already be enjoying your summer.
A little bit. But yeah, no, it's great. I mean, it's amazing how quickly once Labor Day comes and goes, it really quiets down.
Yeah. And we're really excited to have Aaron Miles, CIO of Verano, back on the show. Aaron, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing well, Jesse and Morgan. Thanks for having me on. It's been a minute, but really appreciate you having me on today.
Yeah, we were talking backstage, and I looked it up before the show, and I couldn't believe it's been 588 days since you were last on the show.
Yeah, it's been a little while, and it's funny. It's 588 days of some of the same conversations we had back then, but I feel like
Yeah, right.
we're gaining a little bit more momentum now. But as I said,
Yeah, and we can and we'll dig in. I would say, like, in some ways, Aaron, I feel like the conversation, especially on the federal level, is fairly tired at this point and has gotten exhausting. But I think on the fundamental level, we talk a lot about seeing more bifurcation, as our friend Scott Grossman would say, between these businesses. And I know you've had a lot going on with Verano, so I think on the business side, things are quite a bit different, maybe than 588 days ago.
Agreed. Yeah, we have more visibility, obviously, into the industry, and definitely more visibility into market normalization. I think something I was actually talking to George about today was, we're digesting information differently, and I think that's why you're starting to see companies make some different moves. Back in 2016, you're kind of throwing spaghetti against the wall, trying to see what strains to come out with and what products to come out with. But now we're actually consuming data through our 157 dispensary network and understanding what the consumer wants. And so
Yeah.
when you can actually start using more data and start to become more efficient in the way that you roll out product launches, I think that's been a massive difference since we talked almost 600 days ago. And again, this market normalization, I think we anticipated it, but we felt it in states like New Jersey, obviously Illinois, normalized a few years ago, and we're rebounding in that state. And then this hemp stuff, right? I mean, it's had a massive impact on our industry. I was actually trying to find an actual hemp-derived THC number earlier, and for total sales, and you look at a state like Texas that talks $2 to $4 billion of just hemp-derived products, and you're like, that has such a massive impact. And I know that's beverages and flour and gas station gummies and whatnot, but everything that we've had to deal with as an industry, from COVID to regulatory delays to just some uncertainty in some markets, and then this hemp rising, to be where we're at as a company, we feel like we have a really strong base built, and we like a lot of the moves that we're making, although it's not necessarily reflected fully in the numbers yet, but we're making some big moves to position the company for this future growth.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Morgan, sorry.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, just your point about, because we've been trying to do that same exercise, over time about this hemp thing. And obviously Texas is a big one, but Florida is also
Right.
a big contributor in that. I think the rest of the states are not nearly as big, but those two alone are probably, I don't know, maybe 60-70% of the hemp growth in the last couple of years, right?
Yeah, it's insane, right? So I think we all talk about the federal reclassification. It's a big catalyst, right? So obviously we point to that as a massive positive, but it's not just that. That's the catalyst for this industry. I mean, you start to get tighter regulations around hemp. You see Mitch McConnell potentially coming in and putting tighter restrictions on that. If you can just put a fraction of that market back through the legal cannabis channels, I mean, that's a boon for the industry, right? And then you have states that are getting ready to flip to adult use, and if you do reclassify at the federal level, does that loosen some of the stigma in some of these states to switch to adult use? And so as much as it's like, it pains me to see a lot of red in the markets, and you start to see some green, which is great. I think people are reacting to some of the anticipation at the federal level. I'd be looking at this as a whole. I mean, you see where we're at as an industry, and I don't want to say we're at the bottom, but I mean, we, from a valuation perspective to, all the things that, we've had to endure as an industry. And now you start to look at the light at the end of the tunnel, and you start to think about Florida and VA and PA. I mean, we have 100 dispensaries in those 3 states alone. And we quantified it that, if Florida flipped to adult use, that's $300 to $450 million of top line revenue for us. So while Schedule 3 is the number one priority for me, I want somehow get a capital markets, add on to that. That would be amazing. But even if that doesn't happen, there's still a lot of catalysts that are in front of us as an industry, but it just takes time. So,
Right. And it's interesting from the federal perspective around, clarifying this hemp situation, because some states are, it's just interesting how states are going about it. Like California has this supposed outright ban, but, D2C is, shipping in no problem. And take Texas, for example, they can't seem to come to some resolution around it at all. So it just continues to march on.
well, Morgan, let me ask you this question. You're both California. How big is the illicit market in California? And if you get the government to reclassify cannabis to Schedule 3, and they see the tax incentives of pushing as much business through the legal channels, how much more restriction is the government then going to come in and start to push some of that illicit market into the legal channels? So, as I said, I mean, we've been, and again, it's really hard because those are very, very efficient markets, the illicit markets that have been established. So I'm not saying it's an easy transition, but as I said, if you start to get cooperation from the government and you start to say, okay, we're a Schedule 3 classified drug now, we're a legal business, 280E goes away, which for us is, around $80 million, quantified for a year. And you start to look at what hemp pushing into the legal channels could look like, what illicit, activity could look like being pushed into the, the legal channels. I mean, that alone is a big move.
We could have a whole show on California, right, Jesse? Sorry.
Yeah. It's fascinating, Aaron. In Santa Barbara, we have 3 dispensaries. Well, we have 3 large dispensaries. We have the Glass House with the pharmacy, Beyond Hello with Jushi, and then we have Coastal with my good friends at Gold Flora. Long story there, Aaron. And so we have 3 good choices there. 2 or 3 good choices there. But I really find with my friends that, the illicit market continues to thrive. And sometimes, Aaron, you guys get this, but people say illicit market, we label it with cartels and, poor quality products. But a lot of it with my friends is just, them liking, things that are homegrown, things that are smaller, things that are, more craft. And so I think the illicit market in California has a couple of pieces to it. One is the cartels and, those things going on. A whole nother part is people that just got shut out of the system. And we set up a system in California where if you don't have $1 million in 2 or 3 years on your hands, you're not going to be able to get started. And on cultivation, even if you get started, you're probably, it's going to be a huge uphill battle. So I always just hope, because I have friends that operate on both sides of the fence, that we can create a structure where not only do we have more enforcement and conversion that way, but we also create systems that allow more participation. And that's just not saying let's do more social equity. That's not what I'm getting at. What I'm saying is create a real structure where if somebody's a small farmer, a craftier rosin producer, people making really great stuff, they just can't get in the system. I hope eventually we open it up that way too.
There's a place for everybody in these markets, and it's up to us as a company to make a product that can get people to convert over as well. It's not just
absolutely
in I mean, we were known as a premium quality player early on, and we've had some ebbs and flows, but if you start looking at some of our product testing and kind of the terpene profiles that we're coming out with, it's getting back there. But I remember 2018 when I first got into the space, being in Illinois, and people were like, what's sativa versus indica? And then we would go do some, marketing and kind of test market samples in California. And people are talking about terpene profiles and this and that. It was like a whiskey connoisseur in California versus like somebody in Illinois being like, what's whiskey, right? And so, so I think you have to make a product that can appease, consumers across the board. And again, that's on us, but this, Jesse, I mean, how large is your guys' facility? I mean, to grow large scale and to have that craft grow mentality it can be tricky, but we're,
absolutely,
that's what we like to kind of lean towards, is that premium flower. So.
Yeah, I think the data conversation is super interesting one too. Morgan and I are always talking about Grok and Chat GPT and those sorts of things, on the podcast and ways that we can use them. I think we're all finding efficiencies in our own lives, but at your level or at Leaf's level, Aaron, like you have things you're interested in capturing. We have massive projects going on in terms of trying to get data together in terms of if we run orange cookies and it's cured material and it's 11% THC and we run it for this long through this system, what was the output? Okay, now let's do 5 minutes more. Now let's do 5 minutes less. So we find that ideal time for orange cookies. So when we get the next batch, we'll run that for 17 minutes. But if you give me the lemon cherry gelato, we need to run that one for 22 minutes. And we're trying to find a bunch of efficiencies on the extraction side using as much data as we can get and feeding that into LLMs.
Hmm. And more partners we're able to work with more partners, right?
Yep.
And so early on, again, it was kind of like sticky notes in Excel files, and now it's like our data. It's not where we want it to be, this, and there's still a lot of advancement we can have from a technology perspective and just a vendor perspective. But we are consuming a lot of data, and again, you can run scenario analysis. I mean, your business development, we do the same thing with valuation, right? But you can also do that with different product categories and run kind of scenario analysis of. We did that with our 2-gram Savvy vape cart. Like we tested into the markets, we ran some scenario analysis, and now we can't keep it on the shelves. And so again, we're consuming data in a different way,
Yeah.
and we're doing that as an industry. This isn't just solely on Verano, but I think the bigger our footprint becomes, the more states that we're in, the more we can consume, because people on the East Coast look at things differently than people in the Midwest versus down in Florida. And so we're really able to craft our product portfolio in a different way.
So this is all good stuff, but let me just jump back a second, Aaron. Every time I meet somebody who listens to the podcast, I realize there's a whole range of sophistication and interests out there. We have operators, investors, and everything in between that listens. And some of the hardcores out there are real familiar with Verano, but I realize every episode there's people that might know Verano and know Aaron's name, but really not understand who you are and what you guys do. So you mind just taking a quick step back and let us know kind of what your role is there at Verano, and then maybe just give us an overview of where the business is at today in terms of how many states you're in, what you're focused on, what kind of stuff you make.
Would love to. So I'm our chief investment officer. I wear a lot of different hats here. IR comms runs underneath the department that I run, but I have a phenomenal team that handles a lot of the communications out of that department. I handle a lot of our M&A business strategy, and I work with George on a lot of key business decisions. But overall, I would say capital markets focused, communications focused, because if you look at investor relations, it's you have to create a core messaging. And if the comm side of that equation doesn't mirror what you're trying to accomplish on the IR side, I think there's a natural fit for both of those to come together. And so I think we've done a phenomenal job, as a company, really kind of carving out the story of Verano. But, Verano itself, 13 state operators, started in Illinois. We have 157 dispensaries, 1.1 million square feet of cultivation. We are down in Florida, New Jersey, Illinois. As I mentioned, we're in PA and Virginia, to name a few states that are getting ready to, potentially transition over to adult use. And I don't know if I can run through the quarter real quick. Last quarter we hit 202 million on the top line. We hit 113 million gross profit, which if you look at Q1 to Q2, revenue was virtually flat, but we were up 13% sequentially, which shows a lot of the efficiencies that we're starting to really drive through the business. We've always been a leader in margin. We had 33% adjusted EBITDA margins in the quarter, or 66 million. And it's kind of, we've taken some actions as a company to I guess our top line isn't necessarily where we would have wanted it to be, but we've had to take some actions on the accounts receivable side of the business, where if you don't pay, you're just not getting product. And what happened really, we were the first mover to really start pushing back on a lot of the accounts receivable stuff. And if you look at it, when we first started to do that, people would be like, well, we're just not going to buy from Verano. We'll go buy from XYZ company. And now XYZ company, I encourage people to go look at, balance sheets and accounts receivable and see, if they're up or down, and you can start to see who's pushing back, because, it's starting to take root for us. So our wholesale, we built up our wholesale team. That was down in the quarter, but we are selling into more accounts. We went from 1,200 in Q1 to 1,400 in Q2. And, pricing has definitely had an impact on the wholesale side of the business. Our accounts receivable balance was down 9 million in the quarter. So you can see that we're starting to, make some progress there. But we're a company that will make hard decisions. And, we wanted to make some of these decisions, especially before bigger federal moves, because we know that we're going to be auditioning for new dollars coming in. And so we want to have, the cleanest story out there. And so we really wanted to tighten up our accounts receivable, and then we wanted to really start positioning ourselves in other states. So you look at what happened in Florida last year. We have 81 dispensaries down in Florida, and we are the number 2 player in there according to OMMU data. But that's not by accident; that's by design. Because last year, what we did is we have a 220,000 square foot facility, one of 2 that are active right now, down in Apollo Beach, which is by Tampa, and we were shutting rooms down to go from a single tier to a double tier in these rooms. And so when you have to methodically shut these rooms down, the environmentals start to become different. You have to test the rooms. And as we all know, the first harvest isn't as good as the second, isn't as good as the third. So when you're retrofitting these rooms, you're virtually starting over in some of these rooms. And so we had to take a step back in Florida, where we lost a lot of market share to gain, right? And so, I think we have a heavy focus on Florida, as I mentioned earlier. That's a state that we think is going to be positioned over the next couple of years to transition over to adult use. Last year, we acquired Virginia and Arizona, additional Arizona assets to go into our portfolio from the cannabis. And we bought one of the HSAs that are located down in Virginia Beach. So you start to look at like what early days of New Jersey looked like when that adult use turned on, and you start to think about Virginia Beach, high traffic, population for vacation, and what adult use could look like in that market. Obviously there's a big governor's race happening in fall this year, and really the people want adult use, and Youngkin was just one of those guys that just no matter what the people wanted, he was always just going to veto it. I have personal opinions on that, but we'll just kind of leave that at that. And then obviously PA has been primed for an adult use turn on for years now. And I don't know what's taking so long with Shapiro and allowing tax revenue to leave the state. But, we have 18 dispensaries in PA and a big cultivation facility there. So, and I would say this, I would say overall, Verano just built differently. George was a entrepreneur, owned restaurants, had a construction team headed up by this guy Ari Henry, who's a rock star in the space, and when we won a license in Illinois, George didn't say, okay, well, what do we do now? I mean, you had 6 months to build out your facilities through the licenses that you won in Illinois, and George never hesitated. The licensing part was the hard part for him. The easy part was like, well, now I get to work, and I'm a real estate guy, and I know business, and so we were basically down in Albion building, pretty quickly, and so. Verano built differently, and George knew the value of building a really strong balance sheet. I know we have questions, and we'll probably touch on this at some point, but about our debt refi. Our facility comes due in October of 26, and I'm not naive. I hear the rumors in the market. Oh, Verano's going to struggle, and we're going to pick off the assets for pennies on the dollar. And I usually get a good chuckle out of that, and like to point out that a lot of the companies that are pointing at us are the companies that have sale leasebacks, and we don't have any. And so. We're really confident in our ability to strengthen the balance sheet in the quarter. Again, I mentioned Arizona and Virginia acquisition for the cannabis. As part of that deal, we issued a seller's note, and we were able to retire a big portion of that seller's note at 75% of face value, which saved us about $4 million. So there's things that we're doing to strengthen the balance sheet. We have no sale leasebacks, and we've been a leader in the space, in adult use transition. I mean, we did it in Illinois, New Jersey, Maryland, Connecticut, Ohio, and we are positioned in Florida and PA and Virginia. And so, we want our results to speak for the company. And, obviously I can come on here and talk about how great we are, but, I think at the end of the day, it's the performance that's going to get people invested in us. But I can tell you, we feel like we're built differently, and we feel that we're, a company that can really separate from the pack, especially once you start getting some movement in some of these different states.
Yeah, I think that messaging is good. I found in my seat, Aaron, that you can tell the story, and especially in this environment, like there's limited appetite for, people just telling stories about cool things that are going to happen. I think Leaf is going to change as much as any cannabis company over the next couple of quarters with our farm and with New York. but people can only get so excited with you saying that. Like, it's about saying that. Like, my whole philosophy, and we sit in similar-ish seats in terms of doing things on the capital market side, doing things on the IR front. But my perspective, Aaron, is that you tell the story, you document what we're doing, which, we're shooting videos at the farm, all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, you need to pair that with the result at the end for that to be impactful, I think, especially in this environment. So I think what you're doing is good, which is let's tell what our goals are, but let's really lean into the results, because that's what ultimately matters.
And we're running businesses with a lot of uncertainty. I did tune in to watch the Jamie Mendola podcast that you guys did, and he's a rock star. Jamie's an OG, and when he was talking about valuation of M&A deals, right? I mean, I think about how many goodwill impairment charges have had to happen in this industry, and it's because you really don't know what 2 years from now is going to look like. I mean, when New Jersey was going to flip on to adult use, I mean, there was delay after delay after delay. And so you have to position your company ahead of this potential growth. And so I think, and I'll say this for Verano, and I think the industry as a whole, I think we've done a lot better job of navigating through the uncertainty in some of these markets. And, a point that Jamie made that I think was really key is that, you're starting to price things out more reasonably in the near term, instead of saying, okay, longer term, what does this look like? So if you're going to acquire something in XYZ state and it's going to flip to adult use, and you're going to build out all these earnouts and all these things that are going to be associated, and they want 6 to 8 times from a multiple perspective. I mean, that's just not the world that we operate in anymore. So if you want to be reasonable about your valuation, then we can start to look at M&A from a much more reasonable perspective. But it's, as I said, I love the challenge. I love the pieces of the puzzle constantly moving and the uncertainty, but maybe a little bit more stability wouldn't hurt.
And just one more on my side, then I'll toss it over to you, Morgan, to dig into the quarter a little bit deeper. But I know you had some, I don't know if turnover or departure at the C-suite level is the best way to phrase it. Do you want to talk about, kind of what Darren's role was, what he's up to, and if that's a seat that you filled or plan on filling?
Sure. Darren is a good buddy of mine, and Darren was really instrumental. He's been at the company since 2015, 2016, and he was really right at George's right side, getting Verano to the point that it's at now. So I think you can, look at the press release that we put out. George had a quote, Darren had a quote. I mean, it was definitely tears in the eyes and a hug goodbye type of thing. But Darren had some things that he wanted to work on. I think we said on the call that it's been potentially looking at some international stuff that we haven't been shy that from an M&A perspective we look at everything. We haven't jumped into the international markets, but it's definitely something that we need to start focusing on a little bit more. But Darren saw an opportunity to relocate and give his family a new experience. And as I said, I'm extremely close with Darren, and I learned a lot from Darren while he was here, and I do know our paths will cross. But and to fill the seat, you never fill a seat to fill a seat, right? And so I can tell you, George wears a lot of hats here, and we all wear a lot of hats here. So if the right individual ever did come along that could add value like Darren did to that role, then we would look at that. But for now, it's head down and kind of grinding through the day to day.
All right. Well, yeah, it's curious to hear more about Darren and see what he's up to. And I feel like we've all been in this a long time together. So it's when people are moving around, it's just good to stay in touch and see what's happening. I was just doing a call with a group out of Greece, and was learning about Greece. So to your point, you take the call. You never know what you're going to learn. But looking at the quarter, and I'm very curious to tie this to some of the comments you made earlier about Florida. So I'll get to that in a second. But for the quarter, I tend to look at things on a year-over-year basis, just because sequential is like there can be some weird timing of things or whatever might happen, so things may move around a little bit. But Q2 year-over-year, you guys were down on the top line about 9%. And I'm curious about analyst expectations, what your thoughts are on them for the year. They're currently, I'd say consensus is around down about, a little over 6 after being down 6 last year. So maybe a question with that is, well, I have a couple questions. One is, I didn't understand about this Florida impact. And to your point about you have 157 stores, 81 of which are in Florida, so over half the footprint of retail is in Florida. Was that a big contributor to kind of like the slowing down to be ready to go forward again? Or how do you think of the Florida contribution? Obviously, it didn't go adult use, but the market is still continuing on. We're seeing some patient growth again in the state. But your point about intentional kind of slowing down, how much of that was that contribution last year and through the first, call it first half of this year?
I mean, it definitely had an impact, and we knew it would have an impact. So again, when you think about Florida, we took that step back, and I mean, you can go back and look at the old and new data. Well, and we also had state level disclosure last year too, right? And so you can see how we
Mhm.
performed in Florida, but the dollars were definitely impacted by that step back. I mean, simply you're not selling as much, and that's going to impact the top line. But we never worried, right? Because we knew that we were going to be putting more product into the market as these rooms started to turn back on. But don't forget too, Morgan. I mean, New Jersey. I mean, there were 13 adult use stores when that market turned on. I mean, you had stores that were running tens of millions of dollars, and now that that market's normalized and more dispensaries are coming online, that had a massive impact on us. And so we've kind of joked internally that, we should have turned some revenue away just so our comps year over year were better. But, that definitely had an impact. But that's also not to say, listen, I don't want to sit here and just push blame off on the New Jersey and Florida. There's things that we can do as a company better. And we definitely invested in our wholesale. We brought a new head of wholesale in, Paul Chiladikas, who has really put some parameters around the way that we're now going out and attacking the markets in a little bit of a different way. And so I would say moves that we're making from an accounts receivable perspective, the way that we're beefing up our teams, the way that we're actually enhancing our retail experience. In Arizona, we launched the bodega style, which has been very, very well received. And you're starting to test the waters of some different experiences that, consumers can have. But, overall, I mean, there's definitely been some normalization in markets that have impacted the top line. Florida, was definitely an anticipated impact to the top line, as was, the accounts receivable pushback that, we started to implement it, a few quarters ago. And then, don't forget, we've also rationalized our footprint a little bit. We paused our wholesale operations in Mass, kind of TBD on what we're going to do there. So last quarter was the first quarter we had no wholesale revenue from that state. It's obviously a very saturated state, so we're going to kind of figure out what our game plan will be. And we sold our Arkansas dispensary. So, I mean, there's just little bits and pieces that have impacted the top line. But at the end of the day, could I go out and rip, a bunch of acquisitions? 100%. But, it's not just about top line revenue and numbers, it's about profitability. And, a couple of years ago, we had $73 million of free cash flow. I mean, it was a market leader, and then we invested massive amounts of dollars last year. I mean, tens of millions of dollars into Florida and a few other things that we did. And so, we like where we're at. And again, top line, isn't necessarily where we want it to be, but, we see a light at the end of the tunnel. And Jesse, to your point, we're always talking about positioning for future growth, but I just want the results to speak for themselves, and we like where we're at right now.
Right. Yeah. And, we've seen others do this, just as you were talking about again with Florida, but like how Jason Wild and team at TerraSend had to do a similar thing with their PA grow, right? Wasn't their PA grow that they basically had to shut it all down and start all over? And, it's a hard thing to do that because knowing, being a public company and having to come to the market and talk about it on a quarterly basis and knowing that, people are going to talk about it is tricky. Also makes me think of like technology companies, like one of our companies, FlowHub, they did a huge tech rebuild and they had to basically bet it all on the rebuild of their POS when they launched their Maui. And it was it's a chance you got to take because just continuing on as you are is, if it's not working, you're just wasting time. So it's sometimes you just got to take those moves and do it for the long term.
You know what it is too, Morgan? It's sorry to cut you off there, but one thing that, there's companies that need federal moves and regulatory moves to survive, and there's companies that are going to thrive in that environment. And that's what we're trying to position the company for, right? Is to not just fix the business once regulatory moves happen. And we have to make some really tough decisions right now ahead of that. And so that's some of the moves that you've seen us make. And, George, is a very experienced entrepreneur and business owner, but he can also be very aggressive at times, and he's not scared to make the tough decisions. And we know the investor base that we're auditioning for right now versus the investor base that we're potentially auditioning for down the line. And I need to be able, and I mean, Jesse, you're in the same boat. Like, we need to be able to tell the story. How are we going to grow our market cap? How are we going to continue the growth of the top line? And that's what we're starting to build these businesses for, is to show that sustainable model that build, year after year. And we know who we're going to be auditioning for down the line. And that's why we're making some tough decisions right now.
Right.
Can you unpack that just real quick in terms of, like, I understand you're saying we're a 95% retail audience today. We hope institutions, come across. Institutions have different expectations. But can you give me an example of maybe of something you're doing different to audition for that institutional crowd versus where we are today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you start to look at customer experience and you start to look at, like, on the retail front, there's things that we can do there. We can drive more efficiencies through, our retail footprint by, looking at more automation at the cultivation level. So basically, it's like taking your current business model and making it more efficient, but showing the growth that you could potentially have. But like, if I was sitting on the other side of the table and I'm running a $15 billion fund, this is actually, I was at a conference a couple of years ago, sitting across from a guy who did, he asked the question, how do you get to a $20 billion market cap? So you have to have a game plan to get there. But if you don't have the current base of your business running as efficiently as you possibly can, then you can't be layering on these new components to the business. Because, if you look at, like, what we did in 2021, we racked off 14 acquisitions. We racked off a couple in the beginning of 2022. I mean, that's 16 acquisitions. You got to integrate. That's POS systems. That's everything. So you got to build the base of your business to then be able to grow off of. Right. And so when you start to look at, and again, it's not an attractive model to be like, hey, North Carolina's turning online. Well, that's going to be what, X number. Like, the multi-state model at some point is going to wear out when you start to look at, like, the investors that you're talking to. Right. And so I think you have to start looking, internationally. I think you need to start looking at new product categories. But, if you don't have the base of your business running as efficiently as you can, you're gonna fail trying to build off of that. And so what we're doing is we're cleaning up everything that we possibly can. And when we get money and we're like, okay, let's invest in X area, you start to look in that return that you're projecting out in that area. And right now, the domestic model makes a little bit more sense to go deeper in potentially some states and start to look at enhancing your footprint here. But we're having conversations across the board, and we're looking at everything.
What do you? I'm just curious, because you guys have been acquisitive, and the market has moved quite a bit. What do you think is the state of the landscape as far as acquisitions go? Or, one of the big things we see is unfortunately, a very large bid-ask spread with private companies, with what they think they're worth versus what an acquirer would ascribe a value to them. And it's been very painfully slow, I'd say, in the rationalization of that process. But, kind of curious how you all are, what you're seeing. And, I know, like, you did the deal with cannabis in Arizona, but just curious, as you say, you take the call, which is, I get it. That's the job, is you got to look at everything. But, what are you seeing these days?
We're pretty straight shooters when it comes to M&A. I think a lot of people, play the flirting game, and they dance, and then they, say, oh yeah, we're aligned on what we think valuation is, and then they try to retrade at the end. And I think up front, we're very open with how we see certain markets trading, right? So if somebody's coming in saying, I want 6 to 8 times EBITDA, like, we're just not going to have that conversation. But let's at least stay close and continue building a relationship over time. But I mean, we are seeing, and again, to your point, Morgan, I mean, it's just wildly inaccurate with what people are expecting. And some of the assets that you see come to market are there for a reason, and they're not, necessarily performing extremely well. So there isn't this massive pool of assets that you necessarily want to add to your portfolio. But what I have noticed is, almost everybody's willing to have a conversation, and, we try to set the appropriate expectation up front with where we think things should be trading at. And, really offering the idea of, if you really want to roll in to a much larger operator and get economies of scale and the support and the firepower that, we can bring to the table, then let's have that conversation. But Morgan, you are correct. I mean, it's it's and listen, I don't blame people. I mean, I used to work in investment banking, and the bigger deals were almost easier because you were just purely working off fundamentals. But when you start to get emotion behind something that somebody built from the ground up, they want a premium for that. And you're like, you don't pay a premium for, the time and the effort, the emotion that you have behind the asset that you built. And, but I can say we're a great M&A partner. We actually do really try to nurture to the management teams that we're communicating with, and it's not just a buy and then get out of our way type of M&A strategy. We really like to find strong management teams with strong performance and upside for if that asset were to roll into a Verano. But yeah, again, I said it before, and it is wildly inaccurate with what people, and it's all over the place with what people are expecting here.
Yeah. I mean, as you know, I was just in Arizona a couple weeks ago, and I couldn't believe what single store guys were still expecting in value. And it's just like it's a complete disincentive for anyone to want to acquire that because of the acquisition value, plus if they have to move the license, the location, and then the rebuild, and it's just a negative ROI. It's just unfortunate because you just see people that could exit, but they won't. And I don't know what they're hoping for, unfortunately, because I think for a lot of companies that don't, the moniker I love to talk about in cannabis is hit the bid. Someone wants to do it, if it's might not be the best, but it's going to be something. And the alternative for a lot of these folks is potentially nothing, or worse,
or worse,
because they might have liabilities. Yeah.
It also depends on what people are looking for, right? Stock at these levels, we have to be tremendously focused on dilution of the company. Cash is critical right now because there's no guarantees for tomorrow. I mean, we have ideas of what federal moves would look like. We have ideas of banking. All are great, and we're positioning ourselves ahead of those. But cash is critical right now, and a lot of people need cash right now. So you have to get very creative in your structuring as well. And if you're buying an asset for 20 million, you're not paying 20 million upfront. Like it's going to be spread out over time. There might be a seller's note. There might be things that are associated with that is kind of a win-win for both sides. But and the question I would have, and I really don't know the answer to this, is if you are a smaller operator and you're waiting for regulatory moves, what does that do to your valuation? I mean, I know what it means for us because we're publicly traded, and obviously we're valued off of stock price and market cap and enterprise value and all that kind of fun stuff. But if you're a smaller operator and Schedule 3, let's just say, gets implemented, your value isn't necessarily changing because you're still operating in the same dynamics in the markets of an Arizona or Nevada or something along those lines. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, I agree. Jesse, I'll pass back to you. Just keep an eye on time.
Okay, cool. So Aaron, let's run through a few listener questions here, if that's cool with you.
Love it.
All right, let's do it. So our friend Jamie Campbell on X and LinkedIn, he's a good guy to follow, asks, in a space where transparency is highly sought, I'd like to hear his thoughts on the possible return of wholesale breakdown by state, especially in light of the cannabis PA pivot.
Yeah. Hey, Jamie, thank you for the question. I've addressed this question quite often, right? Because I think some people were a little concerned when we pulled back on state level reporting. Again, we know what new dollars we're going to be auditioning for. And if I'm a buy side analyst putting together a model, I want to give this individual as much information as we possibly can. So, we just made the decision to be a leader in the space to implement state level, reporting, and nobody followed suit. So I think this is more of a question for our peers because we've always tried to be as transparent as we can and one of the most transparent companies in the space. And it ended up becoming almost a competitive disadvantage in certain ways by, kind of opening up the kimono and nobody else followed suit on that. But I can tell you, almost my entire career has been in U.S. capital markets. And so I have a full understanding of what new investors are going to be looking for. So I can say it's not off the table. I can say leading the charge on state level disclosure or just disclosures in general are definitely going to be the strong suit of Verano, and I can also guarantee you that we're going to continue to have our earnings calls. So
Yeah, let's just unpack this a little bit, Aaron, because you're I like a theme you're kind of hitting on here, which is auditioning for different investor groups, and we hope with federal reform that does open up the investor base, and we transition from being 95% plus retail to having more institutional ownership. We have similar-ish backgrounds, Aaron. Before getting to cannabis, I worked more on the buy side. But what I saw there, specifically in the hedge fund industry, is people were largely as transparent as they have to be. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the legendary firms like the Renaissance Technologies, the D. Shaws
Mhm.
of the world, they were not very transparent. And only once big institutional money wanted to come in did they start to give out a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. But they still kept it as close to the vest as they could. And I kind of see that as what's going on, especially with GTI, canceling their call. That they maybe when there's more real institutions and a larger analyst following, they fire that up again. Is that kind of what you're thinking with this wholesale breakdown, Aaron? Is that well, do you think, I don't want to ask a leading question, do you think that once the larger allocators show up, that's the kind of information they're going to expect to have?
Yeah, I mean, lead away. I mean, you have a similar mindset that I do, and I've worked at, for instance, like CME Group. I mean, it was a $50 billion market cap, futures and derivatives exchange. You want to talk about a moat around your revenue? I mean, it's really hard to grab market share away from CME Group, because futures and derivatives, what you open on an exchange, you close on an exchange, so it's siloed. And you would think that's an easy story to sell to investors. Well, we had large investors like a Cap Group, and they ended up establishing a 10% position, which is on a side note. You think about that. That was a $5 billion position implemented by one firm. So here we are. It's like certain days that we trade $50,000 of notional value, and it's laughable. I mean, these markets are absolutely pathetic. But again, when we say we're auditioning for new dollars, and you want people's job to be as easy as it possibly can. So when you Google Verano, obviously you're going to want your headlines to be as, crystal clean as you can get them. You want your filings to be on point. But the reason I bring up Cap Group from, back in the day is it took 3 years for them to initiate a position. So here I am at the largest derivatives and futures exchange in the world. And it took 3 years of meeting with, the investors come in and meet with our board of directors, management team, meeting after meeting after meeting. And we would go into some of these meetings and there would literally be 15 people, like all the laptops out, asking you every question about your company inside and out. And cannabis worked a little bit different. I mean, I'm sure you both know. I mean, like we would go into a meeting and before you could even say hello, they're like, "Oh yeah, I've read everything. Here's $15,000." And you're just like, "But we haven't. I don't even know my name yet." And so things moved a lot differently in 2018 in comparison to what we're about to enter. And so when you think about, I've worked at the New York Stock Exchange. I understand capital markets inside and out. And so when we are talking about positioning ourselves ahead of capital markets, I think a big move that people never really paid attention to that we made is when we moved to the SIBO, which was the old NEO exchange. And while I didn't expect it to be, trading at higher levels, it doesn't have a designated market maker model like the NYSE, but what it did is it put us on a senior exchange. And so when we talk about transition into the US capital markets from a tier one MSO perspective, we probably have the smoothest path into the US because we don't have to unwind any business, restructure anything. I mean, we are just ready to rock on that. And we want to be ready to rock on institutional investors as well. So it's always like we have to put that hat on and we have to sit here and we have meeting after meeting saying, okay, when we actually do sit in front of a Wellington or a T Row, what questions are they going to be asking us? And that's how we're trying to start to get back into that transparency. But again, we'll kind of follow an industry standard and maybe try to stay a step ahead. So,
Just
Go. Sorry, Morgan.
Yeah, I was gonna say a quick follow up on that because I was taking a look at the your investment materials before jumping on today, and I was just curious: do you look to other sectors or companies, as maybe for that idea of like for the institutional capital, what they might like to see and how they like to read information about a company? Just curious if if there's any out there that are kind of your North Stars or something that you would see as inspiration for how you guys are presenting.
yeah, I would say broadly, if you look at CPG, I think cannabis early on got lumped into the healthcare sector because it was obviously so heavily focused from a medicinal aspect, and rightfully so. But I think when you look at, the beverage industries and how they position some of the materials, talking about, trying to increase market share in certain states and domestically and looking to grow maybe a footprint outside of the US, I would say CPG without really necessarily naming, one specific company, but we do a lot of benchmarking. And again, as I said, the comms and IR team here that is very good at what they do. And so, we're going to continue. We don't ever like to get into cruise control with our materials. I think we, probably every other quarter, we like to take a step back and reevaluate. And who knows, there's new industries that could pop up. But for right now, I think CPG just in general is probably the best benchmark.
Next question, Aaron. Someone was noticing the Vireo stock was down big yesterday, and that led to a question about if there's any update on the lawsuit there.
Yeah, I mean, we've taken time to get out into the market and start to kind of voice more of a public opinion. It's no secret. In May of last year, they threw out what we think is a pretty frivolous lawsuit of $1 billion Canadian, and they were very, very vocal about it. Trying to bait us kind of into a public Twitter debate. But what we did is, and as any publicly traded company should, is just take our time and let the litigation process play out. And so, as we said on the earnings call, we've it's been mentioned that we had buyer's remorse, but when you go back to that track record of M&A that we've gotten done, in 2021, we got 14 deals done again. And in 2022, we got, 2. So that's 16 deals getting done in a very chaotic market. So we had a proven track record of being able to get deals done. And, when we initially, agreed upon the terms, we were absolutely fully ready to close on, on the acquisition at the agreed upon terms, which we talked about in Jan of 22. But what ended up happening is new information came to light. And, what transpired over probably the subsequent months to Jan of 22 is we believe there was material enough information that resulted in 4 separate termination rights, including Vireo's refusal to provide their shareholders with adequate disclosures to it, and the board actually refusing to reaffirm its recommendation to the shareholders. So what we have done and what we have always done is we have an obligation to our shareholders. And if anything is going to change substantially from a deal valuation perspective, we have to make sure that we're protecting the company. So we wanted to work with Vireo to come to a resolution. Vireo refused. And so we're continuing the process. And I think one of the biggest updates that we had, and again, I have had to answer questions on, do we carry a liability on our balance sheet? And again, I point people to the facts and figures that we have out there. And, so we're confident in our position. We had a termination right to a termination fee of $15 million and $3 million in deal costs. But the new piece of information that we put in the last earnings call was additional damages claims that we will quantify at some point once we get through the discovery process. So here we are. I mean, we're very confident in our case. And, we, again, have let facts and figures kind of, play out. And, if you have any questions, again, we're not going to go to Twitter and post some controversial headlines. We're going to keep filing AKs and press releases and court filings. And so we're going to keep pushing on. But I can tell you, we're comfortable with where we're at, and we're confident in our case.
Any expected timeline for resolution there?
That's kind of TBD. I mean, dealing with Canada is, it's a little bit of a challenge at times. I mean, when that lawsuit was announced, I mean, our short interest doubled in the 2 weeks subsequent to that. And I don't think that was any accident. And so to get people to kind of pay attention to what's happening in front of them and to get into the court sometimes takes a little bit more time up in Canada. But, we're going to keep pushing on, and we're going to keep, trying to get court dates set, and, kind of more to come on that. But it might be a little bit of time just because Canada operates a little bit different than the US. Yeah. But at the end of the day, as I said, I don't look at this as an asset for Vireo. And I know they went out and marketed on this stuff and have been very vocal about this being an asset for them. But, if you look at the definitive agreement we signed, this is potentially a liability for them, especially in the tunes of millions. So we'll see what happens.
Okay. And last question, we're in this politically active period where hopefully we'll get some I'm so nervous, guys, about even saying the word rescheduling and how I frame it. I'm like, fuck, I don't want to say the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Perhaps we will get some rescheduling news at some point in time. And perhaps after that, we could see an eventual world looking over a longer time frame where we get things like interstate commerce that could come through scheduling or states 2.0, or some different ways we could get there. And the question is, Aaron, is how does Verano position itself when interstate commerce occurs? You have 1.1 million square feet of, I believe, all indoor cultivation. And so this is something, that applies to Verano, a lot of the MSOs out there. So just, how do you see the landscape evolving for the larger MSOs and specifically Verano in an interstate commerce world?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I think we're going to have a lot more conversations, especially with operators like you in California, right? I think there's a world where we can all coexist. We do have first mover advantage in a lot of the states that we operate in, but we just don't have scale in certain areas that some of the California producers do. And so I would say, I think there will be time for that to develop. I don't think it's going to happen overnight where, we're going to get caught off guard and have to figure out what an interstate model looks like. But I do think, we can absolutely leverage our facilities. And, we've talked about this internally. And basically, and I like to say this is we're running an option offense in football, right? And you never know, what the defense is going to throw at you. If the defensive end crashes down, then you're going to pitch it out to the running back. And if it goes out to the running back, you cut it upfield. And we have to come up with a lot of different options for our business. And that's the exciting part. It's also the challenging part. And we've had discussions internally about how we can leverage our assets. And let's go back to no sale leasebacks, right? So if you're an MSO operator and interstate hits and you have a massive amount of sale leasebacks, you're tied into that into probably the 2030s. And for us to have unencumbered real estate, I think it gives us a lot more flexibility in what an interstate world looks like. But probably, Jesse, I think we have some ideas. I think we have to have more conversations and get more knowledgeable on, what will that market look like? And then what does a leaf want to accomplish? What does a glass house want to accomplish? And are there ways that, we can all win in that world? And I do think there is, but again, I think there is brand recognition and being a first mover in the states that we operate in.
Yeah.
And I think that is an advantage for somebody like us, but we just don't grow at scale at like some of the California operators. So, we would have to definitely, take a deeper dive and have some more conversations. But, we've shown time and time again to be able to pivot ahead of new regulation, new market dynamics. And, I think that would just be another thing that we would take in stride.
Okay. Cool. Well, let's transition the conversation a little bit. On here, we usually are talking about that intersection of cannabis and investing, but I think there's kind of an unspoken common bond between a lot of us out there. And I think it permeates operators, investors, and everywhere else in between. In that, simply put, like the last 4 years have been, just an incredibly challenging time and, often, a fairly miserable time for people involved in the industry. If you're an investor, it's been, super difficult. I stopped counting the number of days since MSOS peaked, but I know it was February 10th, 2021. February 10th, 2021 at over $55 a share. Here we are holding on to $5. And so for investors, it's been very challenging on the operator side. Sometimes you feel it both ways, right? I mean, Aaron, I assume you're a big shareholder of Verano and other stuff. And so you have the misery of your, the value of your portfolio going down, plus just all the challenges day over day. And so Aaron reached out, I guess it was maybe 2-3 weeks ago, just to catch up on things. And it evolved into a pretty interesting discussion I candidly didn't expect to have. I think sometimes we look at each other and we think we're all different, right? Like we think, oh, that guy Aaron, he doesn't have the same problems I do because Aaron's at Verano and he's a big fancy guy. And people look at Morgan, they say, well, Morgan's got a sailboat and he's in San Diego and he's got a great tan. Like, Morgan doesn't have the problems that I have. Right. But I know from Morgan because Morgan and I are friends and we talk, and I talk with Emily and I talk to a lot of folks, and you realize you have more common ground in terms of the struggles that you've gone through. And Aaron, in our conversation, you mentioned moving to Colorado and some things that you were working on. And, the conversation got into psychedelics and the way we can use tools like that, use things like meditation to improve our lives. So I'll kind of start there. And then I'm happy to talk kind of more specifically about, how I've evolved my life, candidly over the last 5 years to, manage the chaos and to still be here in a healthy state, which is non-trivial.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for this opportunity because, it's interesting the way that, I'll just speak for myself that I was raised is it was never okay to say you weren't okay. Right. And you always rub dirt on it and you power through. And I can tell you, I've been brave enough and I think strong enough to sit there and say, you know what, I haven't been okay at times. I played, football. I was going to play college football. I mean, you have traumatic brain injuries, concussion after concussion, and this stuff starts to add up. And the scariest thing for me was, it was almost like a dark cloud kind of just came up on me in probably late 22, where I didn't realize just how not okay I was. And it's easy to allow that to happen. But when you look at the world that we operate in, and all of a sudden everything is doom and gloom, everything is no, everything is bad news, everything is delays, and it's easy to get caught up in that world. It almost broke me. And so what I did is I said, something has to change. And so I started out, I definitely, started to focus more in breath work and meditation. And I started to get more into mindfulness. And what it started to open the pathway up is, yes, the NDAA didn't pass or it didn't get put into the omnibus bill, but I'm breathing today. I got to open my eyes today. I got to, go outside and take a walk. And so being grateful for where I'm at, no matter what the circumstances are around me, has been game changing for me. And so what happened is July of 23, I started to really walk into the psychedelic world, especially mushrooms. And what that did is it just opened up this whole new world where, this guy, East Forest, and we've talked about him, he has this saying that basically says you have, the way out is in. And so for me, spending a lot of time, and you don't always have to do like these massive amounts of psychedelics and go to Pluto and have these grand revelations. It can be through microdosing. And as I said, when you start to layer this in with meditation and other things, it was game changing for me. And then fast forward to October of last year, I saw the documentary that we talked about, Music for Mushrooms. And East Forest is basically creating music to go along with mushroom journeys. And it was literally life changing for me. And I remember my wife and I walked out of that theater and we were like, we're going to meet East at some point. And we actually did. We went down to Costa Rica last year and did a retreat with him. And, he's been instrumental in he'll say this too. He's just a guy that has learned some things and, he just wants to pass those on. And so, when I can have a forum like this to say, hey, it's okay to not be okay. And you have people who are in very similar situations as you. Sometimes people just need a hug. They don't need a punch in the face. And that's what I have started to really understand is that, I'm living my life calmer. I'm living my life with more respect and gratitude. And it's kind of led me and my wife to, that's why we moved to Colorado. I mean, she was part of the first licensed facilitators class for psilocybin. We're opening a healing center up in Boulder. And, more to come, probably, opening in spring of 27. So if you want to follow something-KNEW, somethingnew.com is kind of what we're starting to push through. But this is the first business venture where I'm not looking at the ROI. The ROI is healing people and it's passing that word and that message along. And so, there's definitely things that I've done in my life and I'm just starting this journey. Right. And so, but again, I'm taking the time to take better care of myself. I've seen who I surround myself with, what foods I eat, don't drink alcohol anymore, to each their own. But for me, it just didn't work. And so I'm starting to take those steps to live my life as healthy as I possibly can. So, and again, if you want to, East Forest, musicformushrooms.com, go there. It's an amazing documentary and it changed my life. So.
Yeah, so let's unpack that a little bit. And so when Aaron and I were on the phone, Aaron starts talking about psychedelics and mushrooms, and that's been an area where I've had personal interest. I've seen people use them to change their lives, and around 2020, when I was trying to figure out what the hell to do with my life at times, going from hedge fund stuff to running a dispensary to getting into cannabis investing at the absolute worst possible time in human history, had a lot of times where confused about what to do. And so I had eaten mushrooms, in a recreational context, had my fun in college, been to a bunch of shows and kind of used them in that context. But I started digging in, Aaron, to things like, Paul Stamets, who's a, mycologist and a super interesting guy, to learn about. And I started learning about these Johns Hopkins studies with psilocybin and mushrooms. And I decided at one point to essentially replicate that, where I figured out what dose they used. I figured out the setting that they used, which is essentially taking the dose and laying down and putting a mask over your eyes and waiting to see what happens. So you're not distracting yourself with a concert or a hike or anything else. You're just laying there with just yourself. But along with that goes music. And the Johns Hopkins study used a soundtrack that had everything from Bach to the Beatles. And I've used that and eaten a meaningful amount of mushrooms. And it was a wonderful experience. But I found the music was so influential in what happened. It set the mood, it took you places, visually, but more importantly, more in your own mind. And I don't know where I ran across East Forest is a person. That's somebody's name. That's not they changed their name, but we say the name East Forest. That's a person. But somewhere, Aaron, I found East Forest, and I realized he had this album called Music for Mushrooms. And I was like, whoa, someone's actually building music specifically for this experience. And so I did something similar, but changed the soundtrack to East Forest album Music for Mushrooms. And was just one of the most beautiful experiences that I've ever had. And I was telling Aaron when I talked to him that I remember after that night, it was like 11:30 at night, and I wrote East Forest a DM on Instagram, just thanking him for it because it was such like a transformative, like life-changing thing. And so I just want to kind of provide that color, that personal story around it. And so when people want to know what we're talking about, we're talking about how psychedelics can heal people, help people, improve your lives, all those sorts of things. Not for everybody, of course, but with the psychedelic thing, I just encourage people to kind of learn about the different ways to use them. That sometimes it can be an outward thing, like, if you want to use them for a concert or anything else, God bless that. That's a valid use. But there's also an inward turning experience. What Aaron's talking about is this guy, East Forest, has music called Music for Mushrooms. And he came out with a movie, which I watched with my girlfriend over the weekend. And I was going to text you afterward, Aaron, because the movie was just so awesome. Like, it was just so well said. It was just so honest. It wasn't too woo-woo. It wasn't too unrealistic, but it was about somebody who said, I found this thing, how I can help the world. Kind of like you, Aaron, where you're like, maybe I can help with this retreat center. And East Forest, vision is to help, with his music that can help people, explore these different spaces. So if you guys are interested in it at all, at that part of it at all, which is a specific niche we're talking about, I think it's, you can write, Google East Forest Music for Mushrooms. I think it's musicformushrooms.com. If you want to watch the movie, it's I think $10 if you want to watch it. Completely worth it. We streamed it over the weekend. And then Aaron, I think you're hoping that movie gets out there in a bigger way.
Yeah, and here's the thing too. I mean, psychedelics, mindfulness going in can be extremely intimidating, and you don't have to eat 5 grams of mushrooms. You don't even have to do mushrooms in general. Like, you can just do mindfulness if if your life is operating the way it is, great. Like, you don't have to change anything. But I think with psychedelics, and we could talk about this for 5 hours, right? I mean, there's differences between levels, right? Even microdosing, if you look at certain studies that have shown at small amounts, I mean, I microdose during the week, and it's game changing for me, just the way that I feel my body reacting to some of the trauma that I've had in my brain and stuff, and the way that it's reacting to that. But I mean, East Forest is, and I can tell you this, is as genuine as he, in person as he comes off in that movie. I mean, he truly is dedicating his life to creating music for, people to partner, as you say, set and setting, and making sure that you partner that with the right experience with mushrooms. And his latest album, Lovingly, is a 6-hour album. And I mean, it literally takes you through the ups and downs of the journey. And he's really in tune to the medicine. And I think, as I said, it's really changed my life, and really what's driving me and my wife to open up Canoe. It looks like new, but we're really excited to get that moving.
Yeah, and East Forest tours as well. So it was weird that you and I talked, and there's this connection on that side that I watched the movie, and he was talking about him being on tour. So that night, Aaron, I Googled it. Turns out 2 weeks from now, he's going to be about a half hour from me. So going to go check out a live show there as well, which is another way to experience things as well.
Yeah, and lastly here too, I mean, on Patreon, East Forest creates a lot of content. His wife, Marissa Rada Wepner, is also on Patreon, and they create a lot of meditation, and sometimes there's music to it. She does a lot of yoga. So again, if you want to dip your toe into a mindfulness world, it doesn't have to be that blast off, and I was terrified. I mean, I really was. And then I remember at one point, like, literally crying and being like, I've never felt this happy in my life. And again, this is not medical advice, so I think you have to put a disclaimer in there like that. But I think it takes a lot of courage and a lot of strength to say, you know what, I want to look within. And, I was willing to do that. And if anybody ever wants to talk, I mean this sincerely, like, reach out, because, again, people have done that for me, and it's meant a lot to me. But East Forest and his wife, Rada, I mean, they're as sincere as they come, and they truly just want to heal the world, and it's amazing.
Yeah, and I think this could kind of wrap this up that like, psychedelics are one side of it, but other things you said too, and I'm curious to get your take here in a second, Morgan, as well. But Aaron, since I got involved in cannabis, especially growing cannabis, I changed the way I eat because I realized how much the plants reacted to the way that you fed them and the care that you gave them. And I'm like, Jesus Christ, why am I feeding this plant expensive organic nutrients when I'm not doing that even for myself? And so that kind of was my leg into, improving my diet. It was through the psychedelics that I found meditation because I had one trip that went so deep and was so tough that the only way through was to learn how to breathe properly, right? And it was from that I feel like I got the message for meditation, and I've missed, 5 days since in the last, 5 years or something. And exercise is another total piece of this for me where, I do some sort of movement every day. Sometimes it's the gym, sometimes it's just a half-hour walk in the sun, but getting out there and doing something. And so if you don't want to go deep on the psychedelic side, totally don't have to, but there's other avenues where I found, I've been able to, honestly, like, I don't know that I'm thriving because I feel like there's still a lot of mental stress associated with everything going on in the world and especially in our cannabis lives. But I feel like I'm successfully getting through by making sure every day that I'm doing some sort of movement, making sure every day I'm eating as well as possible. Same thing as you, Aaron, drinking less than ever. I don't not drink, but I've probably last drank 6 weeks or so ago. So it's not like a big part of my life. And then last, pairing the meditation with that. So I think of the meditation kind of like exercise for the brain. So every day I want to get some movement for my body, and I want to do 15, 20 minutes of the meditation, the exercise for the brain. And just if I do those things, I can kind of stay calm, stay in a better space, be a better father, be a better boyfriend, be a better investor relations person, do all of those things better. And so, yeah, I think there's levels to it. And if you want to go to the far level and use psychedelics, it's one way, but there's so many other legs in, through these other tools as well.
Yeah, what I would encourage people to do is just do what feels good and do what works for you. And what I've realized over time is that, I don't fight my emotions anymore. Like I used to get anxious and then I would be so pissed off because I'd be like, man, I just want this anxiety to go away. When you sit with these emotions, they're actually trying to teach you something. And so as frustrating as this space can be, you have to take time and sit with these emotions. And that's definitely what I've done. But you are correct. I mean, I'm very specific on what I'll put into my body. I can almost feel it differently now. I'm very much into, nature and hiking. And so that's what I'm saying, do what works for you. If it's boating, if it's swimming, if it's sitting on a bench, staring at a tree, like, it's like, do what works for you. But the first step is always the hardest, but I'm like you, Jesse, like I don't miss my breath work. I don't miss my cold shower every day. I do cold exposure in a bath, try to do it once a week. And the mindfulness, I get up early and I take time to make sure that I do that every day because it literally resets me. I wake up and all of a sudden I have all these emotions that are almost suffocating me, and then it's like, I have the tools, I guess you can say, to continue to navigate through a very chaotic world. But at the end of the day, it continues to get easier. But when you do things naturally, it takes time. People can pop a pill and pop a Xanax or a Klonopin and it feel great in about 20 minutes. But when you're taking the path that, we've taken here, Jesse, it takes time for your mind to react to that and your body to start to transform. But I can tell you it gets better, and just stick with it and just know that there are people out there that may not know you, but they do care about you. And I'm one of those people. So.
Are we sounding like maniacs here, Morgan, or is any of this landing with you? You're frozen, which is creating a terrible, awkward silence. Oh. You're good.
No. I was just letting you guys roll. I can't help but think of a saying that Warren Buffett has, and happy belated birthday, 95 years old and still going. But he was teaching a class, and as the message to the kids was, if you could have one car, any car that you want, doesn't matter what the cost, what would it be? And the follow-up was, and here's the deal, whatever car that is, that's the car that you will have for the rest of your life. And what would you do with that car? You would probably take incredibly good care of it. You'd probably change the oil twice as often. You'd probably wash it more often. You would keep it, in pristine condition. And he's like, now, if you think about that car, that's your body and your mind. So what you do for your body and your mind is how you want to be approaching life. And I think a lot about, what you guys are talking about is, the mindfulness, exercise, breathing, diet, doing what I think, Aaron, you said is a great way to say it, is what you're comfortable with. Because it's we shouldn't be pushed on anything, whether it's a pharmaceutical product or a natural pathway that people want to choose. But I think the big thing that we are fighting with, and the thing that's exhausting for all of us, is that we're fighting to change the laws so people have more access.
Mhm.
That this should be something that people have the right to choose to do, and not be put in jail for it, and not be stigmatized for it. And something that we've all been fighting for a long time, and we continue to fight. And it's really hard. So we all have to be making sure that we're taking care of ourselves, because we don't know how long this fight's going to keep going for, but we got to keep going. And if we all just kind of throw up our hands, it's not going to happen. So I do think it's really good. I mean, in the last couple of years, I've certainly gotten much more strict on my exercise routine, on my diet. I totally understand, Aaron, what you're saying is like, like if you eat garbage, you feel like garbage. It's just amazing. But until you truly separate yourself enough time away from it, you don't know how bad you feel. And it's just amazing, like how transformational it is. And, I'm a big, as you're mentioning about my tan, natural sunlight for me, fresh air is just hugely helpful. So, moving down here to San Diego and being in, in a wonderful climate, and, getting out on the water, there's my most powerful remedy is getting on the water. And it is like fully cleansing for me. It's my time where my brain goes in a completely different mode, and it's great. But but it is important for all of us to be, remembering, being mindful, and taking care of ourselves every day. Like it's priority number one is your body, your mind.
Yeah, and I'll say this too, and I know we're running on time, but a quote that I love that kind of piggybacks on your story is, a man has two lives, and the second one begins when he realizes he only has one. And so, I mean, that's kind of how I've lived my life. And let's not forget about cannabis either, right? I mean, this is massively medicinal. It's a sacred medicine. And so there's so many opportunities for people to heal here. And I'm loving that Texas is doing an ibogaine research, and Arizona is doing an ibogaine research, and HHS just recommended psilocybin to be schedule free. So it's like there's movement, but like we have to get this across the finish line, because every day that we don't have these options available, and these options destigmatized, and to be able to administer these in a very safe and regulated environment, people are suffering. And so I think that's why we can continue to spend so much time, trying to get regulation pushed through. But,
Yeah, hopefully, with our children's, I don't, do you have children, Aaron? I don't think, do you?
Two cats. So yes, I have
Cool.
Rocky and Cece.
Okay.
They're the light of my life. So
Okay. Well, I'll speak for myself. I think about, I think about, leaving the world a better place for my kids. And I think, cannabis and psychedelics, if I was here for the money, I would have been gone, a long time ago. I'm a capital markets person. So, I hope to make some money doing this, but yeah, the opportunity to improve people's lives is huge in cannabis, and in some ways even more profound with psychedelics. I was talking to our CEO Micah when we were hanging out a few weeks ago, and we were talking about, like, if you could only have one thing change for your kids, would it be cannabis legalization or psychedelics legalization? Like, what's the bigger change in society? And we both landed, even though we work in cannabis and are hugely levered to it, I think the way the world can change with psychedelics is super profound, but it's super scary for people to have to, go to the black market and, figure out these things like me at home. Like, I'm watching YouTube videos to figure out, how to do these things in, a safe format while get the desired result I want. Because if you do it wrong, this term set and setting sounds woo woo and fancy, but it's absolutely huge. Like, if you're in a hostile setting, a bad mindset, and you take a large dose of something, that can be very different if you're in a different container where you've come into it calm, and you have the right music, you have the right intentions, you're planning to integrate those learnings afterwards. Like, you don't just put on a headset and blast off. That doesn't fix your life. You have to go in there with the intentions, like, what do I want to see happen from this? Write those things down, have the experience, come out of it, write down what you want to change as a result of it, and then go from there and have a plan to do it. Because just simply taking the drugs isn't the point. They're just one tool in that whole process of improving things.
well, and I'll say this, and this will be the last thing I say is, if you go to, I know this sounds like a plug, but like eastforest.org, he has a toolkit.
Yeah.
And the toolkit is honestly made to do this at home, and it has recommendations. And So, I mean, if you're jumping in, I would recommend maybe having somebody sit with you the first time, or
Yep.
but like, do your research but there are tools out there, and yeah, leave it at that.
Well, cool. This has been great, Aaron. Appreciate the update on Verano. Good to talk about what's going on in the world in cannabis, and I think also good to have these open conversations, about how we can all survive and get through this on the other side and thrive. So appreciate I appreciate the openness. I think for someone in your role, I want to say the word brave, but I think that sounds douchey. But I think it is brave to have these kind of conversations
Mhm.
because people think you're just supposed to be a button-up guy who doesn't do these things, and you've got to realize that everyone's the same. I think that's one of the things I've learned from psychedelics is that everyone out there is the same. Like whether it's the plumber, whether it's Morgan, whether it's Aaron, whether it's me, whether it's an investor, like we're all wired so similar on the inside and have similar struggles. So, like I said, I think sometimes people look at people in leadership roles at these bigger companies and they're like, everything's great for them. It just sucks for me. It's like, hey, man, we're all going through different struggles, but we're all largely facing similar challenges in the end. So I do totally appreciate you being honest about that, and trying to help people.
Yeah, I appreciate being on, and it's refreshing to have a conversation like this where you can kind of not have to be prepared, right? I can just kind of talk openly with how I feel about certain things. But to your point, I don't think it's douchey. I think it's brave, and I think there's a lot of strength in facing reality. And sometimes reality is you feel very weak, but the more you face that reality, the stronger you become, because it's not weakness, it's strength in facing what you need to face. And so again, I really do appreciate you guys having me on, and it was a great conversation. So thank you.
Well, good stuff. Let's not take 588 days until the next one.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah, good deal.
All right, Morgan, always good to talk to you. Thank you again, Aaron, for coming on. Thank you all for listening and watching on YouTube. Do us a favor and subscribe, and we'll talk to you guys all again soon. The views expressed in this podcast are provided for informational purposes only. Nothing we said should be considered research or a recommendation. All investing involves risk, including the loss of principal.